Welcome to our listeners. I am Peter Krekó, Director of Political Capital Institute. In this episode of Political Capital Podcast, I will have a discussion with Evgeny Finkel, Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, and we will discuss the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. We are recording this podcast on the 9th of March, 2022. Listening to the podcast of Political Capital Institute. Let me briefly introduce our guest today. Evgeny Finkel works at the intersection of political science and history and strives to promote a better dialogue between the two disciplines. He was born in Ukraine and grew up in Israel. He received a BA in Political Science and International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a PhD in Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on how institutions and individuals respond to extreme situations, violence, state collapse, and rapid change. Finkel is the author of Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, which was published at Princeton University Press at 2017, and together with Scott Gelbach of Reform and Rebellion in Weak States, which was published at Cambridge University Press in 2019. His articles have appeared in the American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, East European Politics and Societies, Slavic Review, Democratization, and several other journals and edited volumes. Hi, Evgeny. It's great to have you.
Hello, Peter. Thanks for having me.
At the beginning, I would like to raise a more personal question, if you don't mind. You're born in Ukraine. Could you tell us a bit about how does it feel to follow the events that are going on in your homeland? And did you expect it, that it is going to happen as a historian and a political scientist?
So I'll start with, with the second question. Did have I expected it? And yes and no to some extent. So remember, all the scholars of Eastern Europe, of Russia, and me included, we got burned pretty hard in 2014 when nobody expected Russia's move into Crimea until the troops actually rolled in. So now at the end it stayed with us, this caution that there is that predicting something with certainty is simply too risky for us. So on the one hand, I think many other of my colleagues did think that something might happen, but we were very cautious, to make solid predictions, even internally. So my position until pretty much the last day or two before the war started was that, that chance, there is a decent chance that something might happen, but I think all in all, on balance, most likely there would be no violence. On your first question, how does it feel? Well, it feels more than anything else surreal. I mean, obviously painful, very painful. I spent my days glued to the media, to the news coming out of Ukraine, talking to my friends and colleagues who are still there and those who managed to get out, trying to track different childhood friends or friends of friends or who crossed the border, where they are right now. So emotionally, it's extremely painful, but it's more surreal because, well, I don't think any of us expected such things happening in the middle of Europe in the 21st century. And I don't think, anything in my career as a scholar of violence or in my previous life. And, I grew up in Israel, I served in the military, so obviously I know what violence is. I have seen it many times, but on the personal level, I was completely unprepared to what we see right now in Ukraine. So it's a state of complete shock, rage. I barely slept over the last week and a half trying to wrap my head around what exactly is going on. And I don't see it getting any easier. Oh, and obviously, it's I'm in a great position. I'm here sitting in my office in Bologna in absolute safety. I'm just but thinking about all the people who I know, or just people in Ukraine. It's absolutely horrible feeling.
Yes, I would say I can't even imagine, because I think even it is already painful for the ones who have not born in Ukraine and just following the news, and it must be really stressful to follow that, and to follow it if you have such personal connections there. Yes, I think, as you just said, nobody really expected that we will see history unfolding in practically the middle of Europe. And what do you think about the response of the West so far? Do you think that the West have learned the historical lessons? What do you think about the sanctions, about the treatment of refugees? And you have just recently tweeted that you think that there is a 1 or 2 week more attention gap when we can, or attention window, when the situation is followed by the international media, and when new action can be pushed forward, and then the attention can go to elsewhere. So what do you think about the sanctions so far and the responses, and what do you think might come in the next few weeks until the attention prevails?
Right. So, talking about what happened in the West, it just head spinning in many ways. And here I quote, my colleague, journalist Anne Applebaum, and she said a couple of days ago that what we're witnessing is history on steroids, because it changes so fast in front of our eyes, even with the response of the West. I mean, the war started on Thursday, and on Saturday we saw a complete turnaround in decades of German policy towards, armaments, towards defense spending, towards Russia. So overall, if we try to make sense of what the West has done so far, it's pretty clear that they're trying to stay within the limits, within the red lines of the response, which is to avoid at any cost a military confrontation with Russia, because Russia isn't a clear power. After all, now we can argue about, how moral is that, or even how realistic those expectations are. But that's pretty clear that is the red line. But below that, I personally did not expect such harsh sanctions. Mm-hmm. And what I haven't expected either was the business community response, even in areas, even in fields which are not subject to sanctions. So the complete exodus of Western companies out of Russia, IKEA, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, you name it. Essentially, so Coca-Cola just exited Russia. So if Pepsi-Cola exits as well, we're back to 1985, 1986 period. No Western drinks, no McDonald's, no nothing. And that will be, my Soviet childhood. At the same time, I think what the West does need is to figure out how to speak one voice, because it seems that there is, it's constantly moving. And there are internal splits and inability to figure out what exactly they're willing to do when it comes to weapons. So are they giving MiG-29 jets to Ukraine, or do they not? And it changes from one day to another. That, I think, still the biggest problem on the Western side, just to figure out what kind of assistance the West is willing to provide. It's pretty clear what is not going to happen. I don't think we should expect a no-fly zone, for instance. But in terms, within the parameters of what the West can and willing to do, it's pretty clear that there is willingness to help, but no one voice and no coordination of what exactly can be done. In terms of the refugees and the Western response, yes, I do think that the attention span will decline, is pretty short, so something will happen elsewhere, and the world will just move on. Of course, there still will be many people focused on Ukraine, but there will be no such wave of popular sympathy, popular support, and that definitely includes the refugees. And I think we should see many more refugees coming to EU countries, especially those who border Ukraine, like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic a bit further away, but also Germany. Right now, we saw 2 million people, but those are those who are the best prepared, those who have the resources, and also though many of those live in the western part of the country that is less affected by the war. As the war progresses, we will see more people moving in who will be more impoverished, who will be more traumatized, who will need more help. And my fear is that by that time, the Central European countries will just say that, we have had enough, we don't have any more resources. On the political sphere, I think this 1 or 2 weeks is a window of opportunity to move forward with what Ukraine really wants. It definitely wants NATO membership, but even more so, it wants a clear path to EU membership. And Ukraine and also Moldova and Georgia applied for EU membership last week. I don't think it's realistic to happen, but candidate status, I think if it doesn't happen, within the next week or two, it won't happen ever. So that is the window of opportunity I'm talking about.
Yes, this is I think a very important point, and also it's good that you underline the unexpected response from the business community as well. To a certain extent, I think the response to Russia's actions are disproving the most typical claims of Russian propaganda and disinformation, which is about that everyone is cynical, everyone is just following their private interests. So does politicians and business leaders. And also, I think you're right that there is some disagreement over some issues such as gas imports to Europe from Russia. But at the same time, I think the unity of the European Union and NATO is exceeding the expectations of many, including Russia as well, and hope it will prevail to a certain extent. It seems that all of your research topics practically came together in the current events. I'm not sure you're very happy about that, but you have expertise on Israel, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, on political violence, on authoritarian regimes. And I would raise a question about this latter topic. What do you think the current invasion tells us about the rationality or irrationality of authoritarian regimes, and including and increasingly personalized authoritarian regimes? How much is the case of the Putin regime special? How much you think it fits to the general pattern of authoritarian escalation that you have examined a lot through the lens of history and political science?
Right. So I think it does and maybe doesn't. And here the $1 billion question is, what we think about, how we define rationality and whether Putin is a rational actor. And here the debate is, and that the discussion that, we're having within the community of people who spend decades studying Russia and have a pretty good understanding of what Russia is. And, in simplest terms, the debate is whether Putin still can be considered as a rational actor, or whether he, as Americans say, lost his marbles completely, so went out of his mind. And there are good reasons for either. I still think that there are still some basic outlines of instrumental rationality. He certainly made a mistake. He certainly miscalculated during this invasion. But he has a goal, and which from our perspective might be completely irrational. He might, have some demons in his head when it comes to Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure that he does have, and he has NATO phobias. Mm-hmm. And he's scared of NATO, even though that wasn't really Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon, if ever. So the end goal that exists in his head might not be rational, but the means that he chooses are still, within these boundaries of instrumental rationality. He's, after all, he's not in a hope we will never witness the use of nuclear weapon or serious nuclear escalation. And he does seem open to negotiations. Now, there are publications in Israeli media based on impressions of, Israeli officials who met with him, that he has not lost his mind, that he has a plan. He has a plan. He knows what he's going to do. So in that sense, I think it is rational in terms of means that he is using to achieve a goal that is absolutely irrational. In terms of what happened here, it's pretty clear that there is a huge miscalculation, and all the assumptions on which this invasion was built, that it will be an easy victory, that Russian troops will be met by Ukrainians as liberators, that Ukrainians actually oppressed by this Western regime is posed by NATO, they all blew up in Putin's face. Why? Well, autocrats do make mistakes, and autocrats, especially of Putin's type of personalistic regimes, do tend to live in information vacuum. I mean, if you followed, the visuals coming out of Kremlin, you saw the size of his table. There is impossible to convey correct information when your advisor is sitting, 10 or 15 meters from you, and if they hesitate and don't tell the president what they want, they're being publicly humiliated, as happened with the head of the Foreign Security Service during the famous Security Council meeting. There's absolutely no incentive to provide Putin the correct information, and we still don't know what is the kind of information he is receiving. So it certainly does seem that he might exist in some sort of information vacuum, and it might explain the decision that he has made during this invasion, but there's still a long way from here to, arguing that in simple terms, he lost his mind.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would jump to another topic in our broader discussion. You live in Israel for a while, and also you know Israeli politics well. How should we read the recent meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister and Vladimir Putin in a period where there are not so many such meetings anymore between Western leaders in a broader sense and Vladimir Putin? What is at stake here, and what role you think Israel could play in this conflict?
Right. So Israel is in a very peculiar position that I personally do not justify, but I can understand where it is coming from. And Israel's goal is try to sit it out as much as possible without burning bridges with either West or Putin, not for ideological reasons. I mean, there is not much love for Putin in Israel, but for practical and security reasons. The perception is that because Putin de facto controls Syria, Israel has a border with Russia. Mm-hmm. So joining the sanctions and providing weapons to Ukraine might lead to an armed conflict between Russia and Israel and Syria, and it will make Israeli lives, acting against Iranian militias or Iranian forces in Syria much harder, and they try to avoid this for a while. In my view, this thinking is mistaken, but I don't have a direct line to the Israeli Prime Minister. Putin, however, does, and here Israel is a unique situation in which it is pretty much the only Western country that can mediate between Russia and Ukraine, or at least be used as a reliable channel of information, some with a direct line to both Zelensky and Putin and President Biden in Washington, D.C. for several reasons. The main one is that there are many people within the Israeli government who know Putin quite well, who speak Russian as their mother tongue, who can communicate with both sides. Mm-hmm. Zelensky being Jewish definitely helps as well. And Zelensky explicitly asked Israel to try to mediate between him and Putin even before the war started. Putin has historically very good personal relations with Israeli leaders, so Israel right now is the most reliable channel for communication. In terms of what happened during this meeting, it's pretty clear that at least Israelis perceived it as something very serious, because remember, they flew to Moscow on Sabbath, and the Israeli Prime Minister and the Minister of Housing, Russian-speaking, they are both religious Jews, so they violated the Sabbath to flew to Moscow. And pretty much the only reason why violating Sabbath is allowed in Judaism is to save lives. So they definitely took it as a serious attempt to mediate, and not some sort of psychological operation by Putin. We still don't know how serious progress has been made based on that. Again, based on what I see in the Israeli media, it seems that the dialogue between the Ukrainian and the Russian side is actually more livelier and more active than we think. It doesn't mean that it will eventually lead to a deal, but Israelis for now see their main role as trying to mediate. If that fails, I think we should also expect Israel, to join the ranks of the West, because that will mean burning bridges between Israel and Russia in a way that will force Israel to close ranks and finally join the West, as they should have done long ago, and introduce sanctions, close the Israeli airspace for Russian planes, etc.
Thank you. How much you think the invasion can encourage or discourage other autocratic leaders, such as, for example, Xi Jinping, who seemingly have reservations towards the actions of Russia? China abstained at the Security Council meeting of the European Union when it came to the vote on Russia, and also at the General Assembly. So how much do you think that China can be encouraged or discouraged to go into similar adventures? There were predictions beforehand, for example, that Taiwan can be the next victim if Putin's actions prove to be successful. I think the success is very limited so far, and the Russian army underperforms expectations. But generally, do you rather expect a decline in the authoritarian tendencies that we could observe in the last few decades, or you think that it can be rather a booster for authoritarianism? It's probably too early to say, but would be very curious what you think about that in a historical perspective and dimension.
Right. So exactly as you said, it's too early to tell. We still don't know how it's going to play out, and we definitely have no idea how it's going to end up. And I'm also not that much of an expert, not an expert on China, but we certainly do see quite a lot of caution and also surprise and shock among other authoritarians, not only China, but also other regimes. If we're talking about this autocratic international that Putin was busy building around him, in Eurasia together with China, but also supporting far right and some far left group forces within Western Europe, it's pretty clear that this alliance is gone, and Putin is now a pariah. And most of those actors, we see that with Orban, shifting course and closing ranks with the EU. We see it with Marine Le Pen. We see it with Salvini in Italy. So in that sense, I think Putin's miscalculation and Putin's eventually did weaken, the autocrats or the wannabe autocrats of far-right forces elsewhere. Another thing that we need to pay attention to is the economic fallout from the sanctions and the war, because Russia and Ukraine are among the largest grain exporters in the world, and quite a few Middle Eastern states depend on Russian and Ukrainian grain. So, for instance, Egypt, Algeria, it's pretty clear that grain prices are going to spike up. We don't know by how much, but that's another source of instability for autocratic regimes, the fallout from the sanctions. We in Europe mostly focus on the impact on gas prices and energy prices in the EU, but it's a much more serious conversation and a much more serious concern in the Middle East. What happens when prices of bread go up, and whether autocrats such as Sisi will be able to survive that. So all in all, I'm hopeful that in the long run, it will harm autocracy. Doesn't mean that it will strengthen democracy, but at least I don't think that globally autocracy is going to be on the rise after this disaster.
Yes, I think at the end you could bring some cautious optimism into this otherwise gloomy discussion. Evgeny, thanks a lot for being available and sharing your expertise with us. And I do hope that these topics that we are just discussing will sometimes or sooner or later will find some solution. As you said, the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are questionable, at least if they will bring any success. But hopefully, if we will have a next discussion in the future, then the ratio of optimism can be even higher than in this one. So thanks a lot for being with us again.
Thank you. As we say in Israel, inshallah.
Thanks.